with Puff, I don't like him like that. Like, I don't like things that he would do.
Right.
And make me uncomfortable.
So we're speaking on Diddy, we're speaking on Puff.
Yeah.
Okay.
The new lawsuit coming with Jay, the part with Jay. I go, oh shoot, like that had to be there.
We getting tighter, you know what I'm saying? And united we stand, and ain't nothing else.
Black excellence, they're sitting there like, yeah. All right, but Jay definitely not that. That's definitely not. It's just being competitive.
This didn't feel like a joke. It didn't land like a meme. And it definitely didn't sound like one of those drive-by captions meant to trend for 12 minutes and disappear. This felt colder, sharper, like someone sliding a file across the table and saying, read it yourself. When 50 Cent started hinting at how power really rises in hip-hop and let those hints orbit Jay-Z and Diddy, the internet didn't laugh. It leaned in, because 50 doesn't leak with fireworks. He leaks with pauses. He doesn't shout names. He lets implications do the yelling. And when those implications brush against two of the most untouchable figures in the culture, the temperature changes instantly. Fans froze. Defenders mobilized. Meme pages hesitated. This made the Kardashians look like they're arguing over Wi-Fi passwords. The wild part wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't. No timelines, no charges. Just a suggestion that the climb to the top wasn't all spotlights and champagne more. Like quiet rooms, strategic silences, and doors that only open if you know when not to speak. That's the kind of claim that doesn't need proof to spread. It needs familiarity. And the internet recognized the pattern immediately. Whatever 50 cracked open here, it didn't feel accidental. It felt like a reminder. And reminders are dangerous because once you see the scaffolding, you can't unsee it. The moment 50 Cent's words began circulating, the internet didn't explode, it recalibrated. That pause mattered. This wasn't the usual drive-by provocation or sarcastic caption tossed out for laughs. The phrasing felt intentional, measured, and sharp enough to make people reread it twice. When 50 started hinting at how power really rises in hip-hop and let those hints orbit Jay-Z and Diddy, the tone shifted instantly. People didn't rush to clown. They leaned in, because this sounded less like a joke and more like a reminder. Context is everything with 50. He's not peering through the window. He's walked the halls. Shot, sued, blackballed, iced out, welcomed back. He's lived the industry's extremes and still found a way to own his narrative. That history gives weight to how he talks about influence. When he frames success at the highest level as something shaped by restraint and silence, listeners don't hear fantasy. They hear someone describing rules learned the hard way. Rules that never make the brochure. Jay-Z and Diddy aren't just artists, they're institutions. Their names signal longevity, leverage, and access that extends far beyond music. Boardrooms, partnerships, cultural capital, these aren't accidents. So even the suggestion that their rise involved quiet rooms and strategic restraint sent shockwaves. Not because anyone heard an accusation, but because silence has always been the unspoken currency of powerful spaces. The question isn't whether silence exists. It's who benefits when it's rewarded. The internet split quickly, but not along the usual messy lines. One side dismissed it as classic 50 calculated provocation to stir engagement and dominate the cycle. The other side argued that provocation doesn't cancel insight, especially from someone who survived the system he's describing. This wasn't a debate about facts yet. It was a debate about vantage point. Who gets to explain how the ladder is built, the people standing on top, or the ones who climbed without a safety net? What intensified the moment was the precision of the vagueness. No dates, no actions, no names attached to behaviors. Just implication. Implication is dangerous online because it invites imagination to do the work. And the internet excels at filling gaps. Old interviews resurfaced where artists spoke about politics, learning when to shut up, and doors closing quietly. Careers that stalled without explanation were revisited. None of this proves wrongdoing. But together, it sketches a familiar outline of an ecosystem where compliance keeps doors open and friction carries a cost. Defenders moved fast and rightly so. Jay-Z's supporters pointed to decades of visible work, transparent business moves, and public success. Diddy's advocates emphasized entrepreneurship, mentorship, and a career built in the open. These defenses matter. Legacy deserves context, but legacy also magnifies curiosity. The higher the ascent, the more people wonder about the unseen mechanics. That smoothed the climb. 50's history with both men added intrigue without turning the moment into open beef. With Diddy, the jabs have often been playful on the surface, pointed underneath. With Jay-Z, the tension has always been cooler, no theatrics, just distance and timing. That restraint made this feel deliberate, not a rant, a placement. Like setting a chess piece and letting the board react. Timing did the rest. Hip-hop culture is already sensitive to conversations about gatekeeping, protection, and who controls access. In that climate, even a hint weighs a ton. 50 didn't accuse anyone of crimes. He accused the system of valuing silence. That framing pulled the conversation away from individuals and towards structure, how power reproduces itself without announcing the rules. Media coverage reflected that shift. Headlines leaned into shocking claims and industry dynamics, while avoiding specifics. Analysts talked about influence, not allegations. That caution didn't dampen interest. It legitimized it. When mainstream platforms treat a statement seriously, audiences assume there's substance beneath the surface. Even if it remains unspoken. Fans began arguing about architecture rather than guilt. How much power should any one figure hold? Who decides whose voices get amplified and whose get muted? Is silence always complicity or sometimes survival? Those questions transformed the moment from celebrity chatter into cultural critique. And once that happens, jokes stop working. Silence from the names involved only deepened curiosity. In public life, silence can mean confidence, strategy, or refusal to engage. Online, it becomes a Rorschach test. Supporters saw dignity and restraint. Skeptics saw proof that power doesn't need to respond. Either interpretation kept the topic alive, because unanswered questions trend longer than denials. What reframed 50 in this phase was his restraint after the hint. He didn't escalate. He didn't clarify. He didn't chase the moment. That choice let the idea breathe and linger. By refusing to feed the fire, he turned the spotlight onto the scaffolding behind success rather than the faces at the front. Of it. As hours passed, the discourse matured. People revisited past moments in hip-hop where silence felt strategic. Artists who vanished from playlists. Collaborations that never materialized. Interviews that hinted at pressure without details. None of these moments prove anything on their own. But they reinforce a widely shared suspicion that power often moves quietly. And quiet can feel oppressive to those outside it. By the end of this phase, the narrative had solidified around a single, unsettling thought. Success at the highest levels may depend less on noise and more on restraint. 50 Cent didn't accuse Jay-Z or Diddy of specific acts. He accused the ecosystem of rewarding silence. And by placing that idea next to two of the most influential names in the culture, he ensured the internet couldn't ignore the question even if it couldn't answer it. Once the idea settled in, the internet did what it always does when power gets questioned without names being dragged through the mud. It overanalyzed everything. This is where the story stopped being about a single comment and turned into a full-blown cultural autopsy. People weren't asking what 50 Cent said anymore. They were asking why it hit so hard. And that's when things really started spiraling. Memes arrived, but not in the usual laugh-it-off way. These were nervous memes, boardroom photos with captions about quiet rooms, luxury jet images tagged with conversations you'll never hear, screenshots of NDAs jokingly labeled as platinum records. The humor wasn't aimed at Jay-Z or Diddy directly. It was aimed at the idea of power operating behind soundproof glass. When comedy stops punching individuals and starts punching systems, the internet is uncomfortable. Reaction channels and hip-hop commentators jumped in heavy. Not with hot takes, but with think pieces disguised as rants. People broke down the wording like it was a Supreme Court transcript. Why rise to power instead of success? Why silence instead of corruption? Analysts argued that 50 was threading a needle on purpose, saying enough to spark debate, but not enough to cross legal or ethical lines. Others accused him of manufacturing paranoia. Both sides agreed on one thing: This wasn't accidental. Celebrity reactions were scarce, and that scarcity became the loudest signal of all. A few industry-adjacent figures posted vague statements about respect, legacy, and not feeding narratives. Those posts didn't calm anything. They made it worse. Vague defense always reads like internal panic to an audience already suspicious. Meanwhile, the complete silence from Jay-Z and Diddy split the internet clean in half. To supporters, it was confidence. To skeptics, it was proof that power doesn't respond, it waits. Old footage resurfaced like ghosts. Interviews where artists talked about learning the game. Moments where people hinted they were advised to stay quiet if they wanted longevity. Careers that plateaued without explanation suddenly felt relevant again. No one claimed these were smoking guns. That wasn't necessary. The internet wasn't building a case. It was building a vibe. And vibes don't need evidence. They need repetition. Defenders pushed back hard, reframing the conversation around merit and innovation. Jay-Z's catalog, business moves, and visible influence were cited repeatedly. Diddy's entrepreneurial reach and cultural impact were emphasized. These arguments were solid and expected, but they didn't erase the discomfort, they shifted it. The debate moved from, did something happen? To, how does power protect itself when nothing happens publicly? 50 Cent's own history became part of the escalation. Critics accused him of pattern behavior, saying he thrives on stirring chaos and casting shadows without accountability. Supporters countered that he's one of the few who survived without industry babysitters, which gives him credibility when discussing unspoken rules. That tug of war reframed 50 as either a reckless instigator or a reluctant narrator. The truth probably sits somewhere between those extremes, which only made the conversation louder. Pop culture analogies exploded because people needed language for what they were feeling. Comparisons to Hollywood open secrets, corporate hush cultures, and even old mafia myths flooded timelines. Someone joked that prestige TV writers were taking notes. Another said this made reality TV look like kindergarten show and tell. The exaggeration served a purpose. It normalized the idea that silence can be structural, not accidental. Once that idea lands, it's hard to dislodge. Media coverage leaned into reaction rather than revelation. Headlines focused on internet debate, industry reaction, and fans divided. This allowed outlets to amplify tension without asserting facts. Repetition did the rest. The phrase "rise to power" became shorthand, detached from its original nuance, and reused as a catch-all explanation for everything people didn't understand about the industry. Shorthand is dangerous because it travels fast and asks no questions. As the days passed, the conversation widened beyond hip-hop. People drew parallels to tech, fashion, sports, any space where access is limited and dissent can cost careers. The debate matured into something philosophical. Is silence always complicity, or can it be survival? Who gets punished for speaking? And who gets protected for staying quiet? Those questions don't trend because they're solvable. They trend because they're relatable. Behind the scenes, the industry did what it always does under scrutiny. It recalculated. Appearances were scheduled carefully. Interviews avoided certain topics. Collaborations were discussed quietly, then delayed. None of this was visible, but fans sensed the shift. When everything gets careful at once, people notice. And caution reads like confirmation to anyone already skeptical. The loudest change was in how fans listened. Lyrics got reinterpreted. Old bars felt heavier. Success stories were re-examined with new skepticism. Nobody accused anyone of crimes. But the myth of effortless ascent cracked just enough for people to peer inside. That crack was the real escalation, not outrage, but awareness. By the end of this phase, the internet had transformed a vague insinuation into a referendum on power itself. Not guilt, not innocence, power, who holds it, how it's maintained, and what silence costs the people without it. 50 Cent didn't need to add another word. The culture was doing the work for him now, and that's when the tension peaked. Because once a system is questioned, it can't unhear the question. The only thing left was to see what silence would mean next. Confidence strategy, or something far more revealing. When the volume finally dropped from roar to hum, that's when the real consequences began to show. This is the phase scandals reach after the memes slow down and the timelines move on, but the idea stays lodged in people's heads. Nothing was exposed in a legal sense. No receipts dropped, no statements were forced. And yet something shifted anyway. Because perception doesn't need proof to change direction. It just needs repetition and resonance. Jay-Z and Diddy didn't wake up to collapsing empires. Their influence didn't evaporate overnight. But the way people talked about that influence subtly changed. Where admiration once felt automatic, it now came with curiosity, not suspicion, exactly more like side-eye. The kind of side-eye that asks quiet questions instead of making loud accusations. And in spaces built on prestige, quiet questions can be more disruptive than public outrage. For Jay-Z, the aftermath played out in restraint. His brand has always leaned on calculated silence, the kind that signals control rather than avoidance. For many fans, that still reads as mastery. But after 50's framing, some listeners began reinterpreting that restraint. Old moments times. He chose not to comment, not to engage, not to explain were re-examined. Not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as examples of how power behaves when it doesn't owe anyone a response. The lens changed, and once a lens changes, every reflection looks different. Diddy's perception shifted in a more visible way. His public persona has long been loud, charismatic, and narrative-driven. Silence doesn't sit as comfortably there. The absence of commentary felt unusual to supporters accustomed to bold presence. Again, not incriminating, just unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity breeds speculation. Speculation becomes conversation. Conversation becomes context. This is how reputational gravity works. Slow, subtle, and impossible to reverse with a single post.50 role. Evolved too. He wasn't treated like a whistleblower or a comedian anymore. He became a narrator pointing at the blueprint instead of the building. Supporters framed him as someone naming the architecture of power without accusing the tenants. Critics argued he tossed a grenade without owning the fallout. Both interpretations lived side by side. What mattered is that 50 didn't escalate. He didn't clarify. He didn't drop part 2. That restraint let the idea linger longer than any follow-up ever could. Industry behavior told its own story. Brands and collaborators moved carefully, not because anything was proven, but because ambiguity makes risk managers nervous. Interviews were scheduled with tighter guardrails. Topics were redirected. Conversations stayed polite and shallow. None of this trended, but fans noticed the shift in tone. When an entire ecosystem becomes careful at once, it feels like confirmation. To those already skeptical, even if it's just caution doing its job, public discourse matured into something more reflective. Fans argued about whether demanding transparency from powerful figures is fair or naive. Others pushed back, saying opacity is exactly how systems protect themselves. The debate wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about trade-offs. What do we lose when silence is rewarded? What do we risk when speaking carries consequences? Those questions don't have viral answers, which is why they stick around. The media cycle predictably tried to move on. New stories competed for attention. New controversies popped up. But this one didn't disappear, it embedded. The phrase "rise to power" became shorthand, resurfacing whenever discussions about gatekeeping, access, or industry politics came up. Shorthand is powerful because it travels light. It doesn't need context to feel meaningful. And that's how ideas outlive headlines. Fans started listening differently. Lyrics felt heavier. Old interviews read sharper. Success stories were re-examined with a new skepticism, not to tear them down, but to understand the machinery behind them. Nobody needed to accuse anyone of crimes to feel that shift. The myth of effortless ascent cracked just enough for people to peer inside. And once you see the scaffolding, you can't unsee it. For 50, the long-term impact is complicated. He didn't gain universal praise or condemnation. He gained relevance of a different kind.
He became the guy who said the quiet part without
saying it. That's a risky position. It earns attention, but it also invites scrutiny. Still, his choice not to elaborate preserved the ambiguity that keeps conversations alive. By refusing to spell it out, he avoided turning commentary into accusation and kept the focus on structure. Not scandal. What this moment ultimately exposed wasn't a secret dossier. It exposed discomfort with how power operates when it doesn't need to explain itself. The internet didn't demand arrests or apologies. It demanded understanding. How do people reach the top and stay there? Who sets the rules? Who benefits when those rules aren't written down? Those questions resonate because they apply far beyond hip-hop. As time passed, the story settled into a quiet tension. Not resolved, not disproven, just noted. And being noted in internet culture means it will resurface the next time any of these names trend. Not as an accusation, but as a reference point. A lens, a reminder that silence isn't empty, it's active. That unresolved tension is the final cliffhanger. There's no verdict to announce, no bow to tie. Just a culture left listening more closely than before. Because in a world addicted to noise, the moments that change perception are often the quiet ones. And once people start listening for silence, they rarely stop. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because nothing actually blew up, and that's exactly why it matters. No receipts, no denials, no dramatic press conference. Just silence sitting in the room like it pays rent. Whether you think 50 Cent was trolling, testing the temperature, or quietly pointing at something everyone already whispers about, one truth stands tall. He didn't accuse people, he challenged a system. And systems hate being named. Now it's your turn to step into the fire. Was this a calculated mind game from 50, or a rare moment of honesty wrapped in sarcasm and restraint? Is silence at the top proof of control, or proof that power never has to explain itself? Drop your take in the comments and don't water it down. This isn't a safe opinion zone. This is one of those conversations where the quietest takes say. The loudest things. And remember, sometimes the loudest thing in the room is what